Imagine, if you will, the exact sound of your own financial ruin. It doesn't sound like a crashing stock market ticker. It doesn't sound like a bank vault slamming shut or the gavel of a bankruptcy judge. No, for two highly sensitive, fiercely proud inventors in 1957, the sound of absolute goddamn disaster sounded exactly like this. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are taking a trip back to the mid-century modern madness of the 1950s. It was an era of sleek lines, pastel colors, and space-age optimism. But hidden in the pristine suburbs of New Jersey is a story of catastrophic artistic failure, immense debt, and the absolute humiliation of selling out. This is the story of two men who thought they were giving the world the next Michelangelo's David of interior design, only to be told by the universe that what they had actually created was, frankly, high-grade garbage. This is the accidental, completely absurd history of bubble wrap. Our story begins in 1957 in Hawthorne, New Jersey. Meet Marc Chavan, a Swiss chemist who considered himself less of a scientist and more of a misunderstood visionary. And meet his partner, Alfred Fielding, an engineer who possessed the dangerous combination of a high IQ and a desperate need to be seen as trendy. Together, they were staring down the barrel of the late 1950s interior design boom. Wallpaper was having a moment, but not just any wallpaper. People wanted texture. They wanted bamboo. They wanted flocking. They wanted walls that looked like they belonged in a James Bond villain's underwater lair. Mark and Al believed that the flat, boring paper of the past was dead. The future? The future was plastic. The future was three-dimensional. The future was trapped air. Their grand idea was to create a plastic wallpaper with a raised texture that could be easily wiped clean. It was supposed to be a revolution. So the two artists locked themselves in Fielding's garage. They took two plastic shower curtains, yes, literal shower curtains, and ran them through a makeshift heat sealing machine they had cobbled together from spare parts. The machine didn't just fuse the plastic, it accidentally trapped little pockets of air between the two layers. When the machine finally ground to a halt, Mark and Al looked down at their creation. It was covered in hundreds of perfectly symmetrical, raised, squishy blisters. To you and me, it's packing material. To Marc Chavan, standing in a humid garage in 1957, it was the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. "Look at it, Al," Mark reportedly whispered, running his hands over the bumpy surface. "It's tactile. It's challenging. It's an interactive domestic experience." Al, equally delusional, nodded solemnly. "We are going to be richer than God. We're going to change the very fabric of the American home." They secured a meeting with one of the top interior design distributors in New York City, Madame Dubois, a woman whose mere arched eyebrow could destroy a career. Mark and Al carried their massive roll of plastic into her pristine office, their hearts pounding with the thrill of impending legendary status. With a flourish, Al unrolled the plastic across her desk. Madame Dubois stared at it. The silence stretched. The cigarette ash grew dangerously long. "What is this?" she asked, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "It's avant-garde wallpaper," Mark declared proudly. "The air pockets provide a unique, postmodern aesthetic. It plays with the light. It challenges the eye." Madame Dubois reached out with a perfectly manicured nail and poked some of the blisters. The sound echoed through the silent office like gunshots. She flinched. "It looks like a skin disease," she said flatly. "It looks like my bathroom curtain mated with a severe case of the measles. It is hideous. Get it out of my office before it lays eggs." They were thrown out, but Mark and Al weren't discouraged. They knew that true genius is rarely recognized in its own time. Van Gogh died penniless, right? So what if Madame Dubois didn't get it? The public would. They went door to door. They pitched it to developers. They plastered it on a sample wall in a local hardware store. The verdict was unanimous, brutal, and swift. The public hated it. It was shiny. It caught weird reflections. And more importantly, if you leaned against the wall, it fired off a volley of loud, obnoxious snaps that sounded like a tiny, aggressive gunfight. No one wanted a living room wall that sounded like a firing squad every time someone sat on the sofa. Within 6 months, their wallpaper venture had thoroughly tanked. By 1958, the situation was dire. Mark and Al had officially incorporated their company, calling it Sealed Air. They had secured patents. They had leased a massive warehouse, and they had manufactured roughly 10,000 miles of their hideous blistered plastic. They were drowning in debt. The bank was making threatening phone calls. Their wives were asking uncomfortable questions about the mortgage. "We need a pivot," Al said one night, pacing the floor of their warehouse, walking across a carpet of popped plastic. "If they don't want it for art, maybe they'll need it for utility." Mark, smoking nervously, looked at the plastic. "It traps air. Air is an insulator." "My God, Al, it's not wallpaper. It's greenhouse insulation." It wasn't actually the worst idea in the world. Greenhouses struggled to retain heat in the winter. The trapped air in their plastic sheets could theoretically act as a thermal barrier. Armed with a desperate, frantic new energy, they pivoted away from the glamorous world of Fifth Avenue interior design and drove out to the muddy farmlands of New Jersey to pitch to men named Earl who chewed tobacco. Mark delivered an impassioned speech about thermodynamics, thermal retention, and agricultural revolution. The farmer just wanted to know if it was cheap. And it was. They sold their first major batch to a commercial greenhouse. For exactly 3 days, Mark and Al thought they had finally made it. They popped open a bottle of cheap champagne. They imagined themselves as the barons of agricultural insulation. And then the sun came out. Here's a fun fact about 1950s unrefined experimental plastic sealing. When you expose it to extreme, direct, sustained ultraviolet sunlight, it begins to degrade rapidly. The plastic didn't just insulate, it baked. The air inside the bubbles superheated. By noon on the 4th day, the farmers walked into their greenhouses to a horrifying symphony. The heat was causing the air pressure inside the bubbles to expand until they spontaneously detonated. And it got worse. The plastic began to melt, dripping gooey, toxic-smelling resin onto the prize-winning heirloom tomatoes. The farmers were furious. The crops were ruined. Mark and Al were chased off the property with pitchforks. Metaphorically, but knowing 1950s New Jersey farmers, perhaps literally. They had to refund every cent. Their grand pivot was a complete disaster. They were no longer just broke. They were in the hole, facing total financial annihilation. Hey, if you're enjoying this story, do me a solid and support independent history storytelling by hitting that subscribe button. Done it? Awesome. Let's get back to the madness. It was the winter of 1959. The warehouse was freezing because they couldn't afford to pay the heating bill. The bank had sent a final notice of foreclosure. They had exactly 30 days before the bank seized the warehouse, the patents, the machines, and probably their homes. Mark Chavan was losing his mind. He had spent the last week practically living in the warehouse, furiously sketching new, impossible applications for the plastic. Maybe it could be a raincoat. Maybe it could be a flotation device for nervous swimmers. Maybe it could be a textured canvas for abstract expressionist painters. Al Fielding walked in, holding a manila folder containing their dismal accounting ledgers. His breath plumed in the freezing air. What followed was one of the greatest, most absurdly dramatic confrontations in the history of modern invention. "Mark," Al said, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion, "put the goddamn broom down." Mark paused, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Al, listen to me. Tennis racket grips. It's orthopedic. It cushions the palm." "We owe the bank $40,000, Mark!" Al screamed, the sound echoing off the mountains of plastic. $40,000! The bank doesn't care about tennis racket grips. My wife is threatening to move back in with her mother. We are finished. Mark dropped the broom. His artistic pride, battered and bruised for 2 years, flared up defensively. "We are not finished. The material is flawless. It's the world that is broken. The world lacks vision. They rejected the wallpaper because they are terrified of modernity." "It's not art, Mark," Al roared, throwing the manila folder onto the floor. "It's bullshit. It's craptastic, ugly, noisy, annoying plastic garbage. We wasted 3 years of our lives making miles of this product that is entirely, fundamentally, 100% useless." "Do not insult the material," Mark shouted back, his Swiss accent thickening with rage. He grabbed a sheet from the nearest pallet and shook it violently in Al's face. "This is our legacy. It is beautiful." "It's a disease," Al yelled, grabbing the other end of the sheet. For a moment, the two grown men engaged in a pathetic, high-stakes tug-of-war over a piece of plastic. They yanked back and forth, chests heaving, glaring at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. And then Mark, trying to rip the sheet from Al's hands, squeezed his fist tightly around the plastic. The sound was sharp and ridiculous. Al froze. He looked down at the plastic trapped between them. He squeezed his own hand. They stood there in the freezing warehouse, panting, staring at the little deflated craters in the plastic. "Did you feel that?" Al whispered, his voice suddenly completely devoid of anger. "Feel what?" Mark asked, still defensive. "When it popped," Al said, his engineering brain suddenly overriding his emotional breakdown. "It absorbed the force of my hand. The air took the impact before the plastic broke." Al let go of the sheet, walked over to a workbench, and picked up a heavy steel wrench. Mark watched him, terrified that his partner had finally snapped and was about to murder him. Instead, Al walked over to the concrete floor, laid down a double layer of the plastic wrap, and held the heavy wrench at shoulder height. "Watch," Al said. He dropped the wrench. Mark and Al stared at the wrench. The silence in the warehouse was deafening. Al looked up at Mark. The artistic dream of wallpaper was officially dead, but a new multi-million-dollar reality had just been born. "Mark," Al said quietly, "forget the aesthetics. Forget the art. We aren't interior designers." "What are we?" Mark whispered. "We're a moving company." The timing was nothing short of miraculous. While Mark and Al were having their dramatic breakthrough in a freezing warehouse, International Business Machines, IBM, was having a massive crisis of its own. IBM had just announced the release of the IBM 1401. It was a revolutionary data processing system, a computer that was finally small enough to fit into a single room rather than taking up an entire building. It was going to change the world. Everyone wanted one. There was just one massive, glaring problem. The IBM 1401 was incredibly delicate. These machines were packed with thousands of fragile components. If a truck hit a pothole too hard on the way to a client, the machine would arrive completely shattered. The traditional shipping materials of the 1950s were useless. They used balled-up newspaper, which crushed too easily. They used sawdust, which was a nightmare because the dust would get into the sensitive computer components and fry the circuits. IBM was desperate. They needed a material that was lightweight, dust-free, and capable of absorbing massive amounts of shock. Al Fielding saw an article about the IBM 1401 in a trade magazine. He slammed it down on Mark's desk. "This is it," Al said. "This is our whale." Mark looked at the photo of the giant, gray, soulless metal boxes. His artistic soul physically recoiled. "You want me to take my masterpiece, my textured architectural innovation, and use it to wrap up a glorified adding machine? You want us to pitch our art as packing trash?" Al grabbed Mark by the shoulders. "Mark, look at me. They have money. We do not. Do you want to be a starving artist, or do you want to pay off the bank?" It was the ultimate test of their friendship and their pride. Mark had to swallow his massive ego, take his beloved avant-garde wallpaper, and present it to the most corporate, rigid, uncreative entity on the planet. He took a deep breath. "Fine, but I'm not wearing a gray flannel suit." In late 1959, Mark Chavan and Alfred Fielding walked into the belly of the beast. The executive boardroom of IBM was a terrifying place. It smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and raw capitalism. Sitting at the end of a long mahogany table were 3 top IBM executives. They were the very picture of 1950s corporate America. Identical haircuts, identical suits, faces carved out of stone. Let's call the lead executive Mr. Stone, because honestly, that's how he acted. "Gentlemen," Mr. Stone said, checking his watch, "you have exactly 5 minutes to tell me why you're wasting my time. We are trying to launch the most sophisticated machine in human history, and my logistics team tells me you two run a failed wallpaper company in New Jersey." Mark bristled. He opened his mouth to defend his wallpaper, but Al swiftly kicked him in the shin under the table. "Mr. Stone," Al said smoothly, "you don't need logistics. You need a miracle. Your 1401 computers are arriving at your clients in pieces because newspaper and sawdust belong in the 19th century. We're here to offer you the 21st century." Al nodded to Mark. This was the moment, the grand demonstration. Mark reached into the burlap sack. The executives leaned forward, expecting to see some highly engineered space-age foam. Instead, Mark pulled out a massive, crinkled sheet of their bubbly plastic. It looked cheap. It looked ridiculous. The executives stared at it. Mr. Stone frowned. "What in God's name is that? Is that a diseased shower curtain?" Mark twitched. It was the exact same insult Madame Dubois had used 2 years ago. He was about to launch into a tirade about postmodern aesthetics, but he caught Al's terrifying glare. "It is proprietary atmospheric encapsulation technology," Mark lied through his teeth, sounding as scientific as possible. "We call it bubble wrap." "It looks like garbage," Mr. Stone said. "You want me to wrap a $500,000 computer like a plastic toy?" "I don't want you to wrap it," Al said, stepping forward. "I want you to drop it." Al reached into his own bag and pulled out an incredibly expensive, delicate piece of IBM equipment, a complex glass vacuum tube assembly that he had begged, borrowed, and practically stolen to get for this meeting. The executives gasped. "Hey, put that down," Mr. Stone yelled, standing up. "That is a $400 component. If you break that, I will sue you into oblivion." "If it breaks," Al said, "we will give you our company." Before the executives could stop him, Al tossed the fragile glass component to Mark. Mark caught it, quickly wrapped it in 3 layers of bubble wrap, and taped it shut. The room went dead silent. Mark walked over to the open window of the boardroom. They were on the 2nd floor, overlooking a concrete courtyard. "Are you insane?" Mr. Stone demanded. Mark didn't answer. He just held the wrap package out the window. He looked at Al, and Al nodded. Mark let it go. It took exactly 1.5 seconds for the package to hit the ground. But for Mark and Al, it felt like an eternity. Everything, their life savings, their warehouses, their marriages, their sanity, was riding on the integrity of those little pockets of trapped air. Smack! Bounce! The package hit the concrete, bounced lazily into the air, and rolled to a stop. Mr. Stone and the executives rushed to the window, staring down at the little bundle. "Go get it," Mr. Stone barked at a junior executive. The executive sprinted out of the room, down the stairs, and into the courtyard. The boardroom waited in agonizing silence. Mark was sweating profusely. Al was clenching his fists so hard his knuckles were white. 2 minutes later, the junior executive burst back into the room out of breath. He walked over to the mahogany table, placed the plastic bundle down, and took out a pocket knife. He sliced through the tape. He peeled back the layers of plastic. Mr. Stone slowly reached out and picked up the delicate component. He examined it under the light. He looked at the junior executive. He looked at Al. And finally, he looked at Mark. The stone-cold corporate facade finally cracked. Mr. Stone looked at the sheet of bubble wrap lying discarded on the table. He reached out, put his thumb on one of the bubbles, and pressed. A tiny smile played at the corner of Mr. Stone's mouth. It pops," he said, sounding almost like a child. "Yes, sir," Al said, his voice shaking with relief. "It pops." Mr. Stone looked back up. "We'll take 10,000 rolls immediately." And just like that, the course of history was altered. The IBM 1401 shipped safely across the country, secured tightly in the loving, protective embrace of Mark and Al's failed wallpaper. Once IBM adopted it, the rest of the world followed. Suddenly, every tech company, every moving company, every logistics firm on the planet realized that newspaper and sawdust were obsolete. Bubble wrap became the undisputed king of shipping. Sealed Air, the company Mark and Al founded, exploded. They didn't just pay off their debt, they became multi-millionaires. They opened factories across the globe. Today, Sealed Air is a Fortune 500 company that generates billions of dollars in revenue every single year. Mark Chavan and Alfred Fielding never got to see their plastic displayed in the Museum of Modern Art. They never revolutionized mid-century interior design. The world entirely rejected their artistic vision. But in doing so, the universe handed them an empire built entirely on packing trash. It's the ultimate irony. Mark Chavan wanted to create a texture that people would admire from afar, a sophisticated visual statement for the elite. Instead, he created something so universally satisfying, so deeply addictive, that it is impossible for any human being, regardless of age or status, to be handed a sheet of it without mindlessly, aggressively popping it until their thumbs ache. He didn't create great art. He created the world's greatest fidget toy. And he got incredibly, filthy rich doing it. So, next time you get a package in the mail and you pull out that glorious sheet of plastic, remember the two desperate, screaming men in a freezing New Jersey warehouse who had to give up their dreams of high art just to keep the lights on. Give it a pop for Mark and Al. Thanks for watching Audacious History. See you next time.